1415. It is an annual committee hearing that we have to take a first look, if not in great detail, as we will have upcoming full budget committee hearings and overview of the budget every Thursday for the next 4 weeks or so, with just 1 week off. And I make mention of this not only to invite those who are with us today to come back and be with us in the coming weeks, but also given that we will have limited time to hear both from the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst Office today. Obviously, we can't do the entire budget in great detail in just a few hours. That given that next Thursday, January 30th, we'll have a full hearing on corrections and rehabilitations. The following Friday, we'll have a full hearing on the Coordinated Care Initiative, a joint hearing with the Senate Health Committee. The following Friday, February 13th, we'll do a full hearing on cap and trade. Take the following week off, and then on the 27th, we'll be digging into the budget reserve issue. So with that noted, if we can keep our questioning to some of the other subjects that we will not be getting to in full budget committee hearings, we'd like to invite up the Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Finance, someone well known to this committee, and it's great to see you again, Ms. Bossler.
Can we do an opening?
Sure. And then we also want to invite up our Legislative Analyst Office, represented by its Director, Mac Taylor. And before we begin, we would like to invite our acting Vice Chairman of the committee, Senator Berryhill. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to a very interesting year. Despite a few areas of disagreement, Republicans generally are pleased with the governor's plan. It largely reflects the same values that we Republicans have been advising for years, which is spending restraint, paying off our debts, and building a prudent budget reserve. We have seen improvements in the state's economy, but we certainly aren't out of the woods yet. There are some things this budget falls short on. California's unemployment rate remains close to or at 9%. In my area, the Central Valley and other rural areas, it's even higher. Clearly, we need to do much more to get all Californians the jobs that they need. And for the life of me, I'm trying to figure out why we are talking about revisiting the rainy day fund. It's already been passed and scheduled for a vote of the people this fall. ACA 4 passed with a bipartisan support and is good, solid policy that protects the state during economic downturns. My fear here is that this so-called revisiting is really about weakening what has already been agreed to, and in my opinion, that isn't a good idea. Also, my local law enforcement has not been shy about telling me of their struggles under the shift of state criminals to local facilities. I think this budget comes up short on addressing that issue also. So, I guess while we are all generally pleased, I would like to take a look at the areas mentioned. I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues here on the Budget Committee and with the Governor's Office. So with that, we can make this plan for all of California. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. All good points that we will be addressing today. And clearly we have a much brighter outlook that we've seen in recent years. Ms. Bossler, we welcome you.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Keely Bosler with the Department of Finance, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning to present to you the Governor's 2014-15 budget. And I have passed out a few slides that are mainly lifted from the Governor's budget, just to emphasize a few things as we walk through an overview today of the Governor's budget. Turning to the first slide, in what is probably now a pretty famous slide after yesterday's State of the State. I think the most important thing to get from this chart is that the last decade has really been a tumultuous one.
I promise not to bark.
Okay. A tumultuous one for the state budget, and I don't have to tell many of the senators sitting on the dais, as many of you have lived through it. But in 2011, shortly after Governor Brown was elected, the state was facing a $26.6 billion deficit and nearly a $20 billion ongoing gap between expenditures and revenues. But through the hard work and many tough spending cuts, and also Proposition 30 and the temporary taxes that were passed by the voters, the deficits that we were facing have now turned into a small surplus in the 14-15 fiscal year. But as history has shown us, times of relative fiscal balance can be quickly followed by deficits and budget crises. So this budget really has a particular emphasis on maintaining the state's fiscal balance in the budget year, but also over the forecast period. The governor's budget pays down debts, and it also, because of Proposition 30, we are able to make a significant investment in education in the governor's budget. Moving on just to the next slide, where we've graphed out since 1970 capital gains realizations. I think this graph really illustrates the unpredictable nature of capital gains revenues. And we believe that these revenues are a major source of the state's current surplus. And the budget is currently based on $4 billion in what we would refer to as windfall capital gains revenues that are above what would be received in a normal year. And just as another example, just a few short years ago, we received $3 billion from capital gains related revenues, and in the budget year, we're expected to have over $10 billion in revenues related to capital gains. So this really is truly a very unpredictable revenue source, and it's a big source of our volatility in California. The other thing that worries us about the current surplus and its ability to be lasting is the fact that Proposition 30 is temporary taxes, and the first of those taxes will be expiring at the end of 2016. In addition, there are many other risks that remain to the state's budget, in addition to the capital gains revenues. Healthcare costs also continue to worry us. This month, enrollment has started with a historic healthcare reform. This is providing expanded services to millions of Californians, and millions more Californians are also covered by health insurance for the first time. But this also has now resulted in a budget that is much more dependent on the rate of healthcare inflation. So that continues to be a risk into the future. Also, federal fiscal challenges continue to be a risk, and while the risk has become more muted in recent weeks, and we're very thankful that we have a budget resolution through at least September that improves the stability in the short term, but there continues to be some concern that actions by Congress and the President may have a negative impact on the state's fiscal situation. Also, we continue to work hard on the implementation of the dissolution of redevelopment. The cities, counties, special districts, and schools have received to date about $7 billion in revenues related to that dissolution that have been able to be invested into core services, but recent trial court decisions have put at risk about $3 billion of that $7 billion, so that also continues to be a risk. Also, the state continues to face a prison population cap by the federal courts, and while this budget is built on a 2-year extension, if that extension is not granted, there may be an additional need for resources above and beyond what the budget has provided in order to avoid any early release of inmates that have been committed for serious and violent offenses. Also, the threat of recession, and while our forecast and the LAO's forecast don't foresee a recession in the near term, the state is already 4.5 years into its current expansion business cycle, and history would tell us that it would be a historical anomaly if we didn't see another slowdown in the next few years. So that continues to be also a threat. And then finally, something we've been talking a lot about are the state's debts and liabilities that remain. And while we do, the governor does place an emphasis on paying down those debts, there continue to be even additional debts that will need to be addressed over a multi-year period. And if you turn to the next slide, you see a list of over $340 billion in the state's long-term liabilities.
Just on
yeah,
that slide on page
yeah.
5, with regard to the unfunded retirement liabilities, that $217.8 billion would not necessarily all fall on on state government.
That is true. It could be a whole mix of things because this does include PERS and STRS and retiree health as well.
So I just point that out because I think we need to be a little bit careful when we throw out these big numbers because they frighten a lot of people. And that which is our responsibility, we, of course, are here to attend to, but
yeah.
not those that are not.
I think we would recognize that it's a number that needs to be addressed, but
Yes. And you do have, you label the slide as California's.
yeah.
What, excuse me, what portion do you think is our liability?
I don't think we have a current estimate for that, but I mean, I think it's all of ours to figure out the best way to address. And I think, we, like specifically to the STRS liability, we're, working with stakeholders to try and find, craft a compromise. But I don't think we have a number per se on what's ours versus, it's all of California's, and I think it's incumbent on us to start crafting solutions to address it over the long term.
No matter what that number ends up being, this is a number that everybody should be concerned about as we move forward.
We agree.
May I inquire also, Senator Leno?
Senator Jackson.
Yes. There's 33.9 billion, in unissued bonds. Could you identify those, and if they're unissued, does that necessarily mean that they will at some point be issued? And could you tell us what areas those include?
Yeah, so this is, these are bonds that go back even a couple decades, but a lot of them have to do with resources and environmental protection. And our 5-year infrastructure plan does have a plan to issue the majority of the remaining general obligation bonds over the next 5 years or so. But these are things that are dedicated for specific projects. In some cases, some of the older bonds that are still not expended are for very specific projects, and maybe there may be need to have some discussion to maybe repurpose some of those if it's not necessarily a project that's going to go forward. But
So how does that compare to the so-called wall of debt? Are those bonds that have already issued and we're paying on those? Is that where that?
So the wall of debt is on this list. It's a subset of the long-term liabilities. The wall of debt was a point in time, more short-term list of short-term liabilities. Unissued bonds, well, we haven't actually issued the bonds, so we haven't actually appropriated the money in the budget. And so they are authorized by the voters, and in some cases, their lease revenue bond authority that was authorized through prior legislation or the Budget Act. But they are bonds that are currently on the books that were authorized to go out and sell on the market. And this is just, the total value of that unauthorized debt, or authorized debt that hasn't been issued yet. That's right. The terminology. So it's authorized, it's not issued.
So the number 342 billion includes unfunded retirement liabilities that are the responsibility of CalPERS and CalSTRS and perhaps some others, as well as unissued bonds for which the obligation has not yet arisen to repay. So that number is sort of, I don't know if you'd call it worst case scenario, but it's a number that's subject to some adjustment potentially. Is that?
The unissued bonds is definitely still, in most cases, something that can be controlled. by the Budget Act, by the legislative branch and the executive branch in terms of how we allocate those monies over the next few years or over a 10-year period. You could make a policy decision to take longer to spend those bonds and then.
And then with one question, I apologize
Short
if
term.
I'm interrupting you, but the unfunded retirement liabilities, that number, is that based upon the stock market, so that if the market continues to go up, will that number just increase by the fact that the market is doing better? Or is that number some sort of a fixed number of liability?
There's definitely assumptions embedded in that number about what the return will be.
Could you tell us what those assumptions are?
I actually don't have that right in my head.
Okay.
Well, Senator, if I could, a key assumption, of course, is what is your assumed earnings rate. But to the extent that the market does well, that number could come down. So it does change from year to year, and it can change drastically. It could go up or down significantly.
So this number includes the market having had a good year last year, or is that not included in the adjustment figure? I mean, it's a huge number, there's no
I
question
think
about it, but what is the
because
number?
they smooth out, it can change, and you need to catch up. So, in fact, as you realize those gains that are in the market, the number will probably go down.
Erica Lee with the Department of Finance, and just wanted to let you know that assumed interest is 7.5% right now. That's currently what's assumed into that number.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Roth.
Well, not to belabor this, Keeley, but with respect to the unfunded retirement liabilities, so what that means is, I mean, if I'm understanding it, that given the assumed interest rate, somebody should have been paying more into the fund to properly fund the retirement benefits that are due and payable at some point. And the somebody is either the state, the local government entities, or the participants in the plan, right? And so the reason it's difficult to tell who owes the money is, I gather, because the payment rates differ from the contractual obligation. That's a matter of negotiation as to whether the state pays more or local government pay more or the participants in the plan pay more or all of the above to get us up, plus hopefully an improved market performance to get us up to zero or at least on an even keel. Am I understanding this?
Yeah, that's exactly the conversation that needs to occur about some of the long-term liabilities, and especially the STRS liability. We have a discussion in the budget summary this year about that discussion needs to happen, and there needs to be a plan put in place.
Which is why it's difficult to answer my colleague's question about who owes it, because it depends on how the negotiations turn out, I assume.
You're exactly right. Yeah.
Colleagues, we'll be happy to take more questions. Keep in mind that we will have a full Budget Committee hearing on this a few Fridays from now when we talk about the budget reserve. We can't talk about the budget reserve without a clear understanding of what our liabilities are. So we'll have time to get into that deeper. I'm hoping that we can keep our comments to some of the items that we won't be getting to for full Budget Committee hearings in subsequent Thursdays. But I'm happy to take questions. Senator Hancock and then Senator Berryhill.
Yeah. Just quickly, can you tell us the major components of the wall of debt? I'm remembering that about $6 billion of the 13 is the Schwarzenegger bonds. And what is the rest of it? Is it money all owed to various state departments?
It is mainly, before the $11 billion that this budget proposes to invest in paying down the wall of debt, it was a significant portion was related to school deferrals. Also, mandate costs that are owed schools and also local governments are also included on the wall of debt. The economic recovery bonds, which are the bonds that were issued in 2004 to pay off deficits from as far back as 2002. The budget also proposes to make a supplemental payment to pay those bonds off early. Also, special fund loans that were heavily called upon during bad economic times to help the state's situation are also on the wall of debt. And I may be forgetting a few other.
Okay. Are we talking $6 billion to the economic recovery bonds?
There's an additional $1.7 billion payment.
So out of the 13, about half is that?
No, so the $13 billion would be what's remaining after the $11 billion that's proposed to be paid in the budget year. So $13 billion that remains is mainly related to probably mandates to both local governments and schools. Also, other loans to special funds.
But they were intergovernmental loans, meaning that schools and various departments will have a one-time sum of money that they can use in a variety of ways, right?
That's right.
Okay, thank you. And it's the whole 13. Okay.
Thank you, Senator. Before we get to Senator Berryhill, we're going to establish our quorum. If you could call the roll, please.
Leno,
Here.
Nielsen, Anderson, Bell, Berryhill, Locke, Desaulnier, Hancock,
Here,
Jackson, Mitchell, Monning, Roth, Torres, Walters, Wright, Wyland. We have a quorum.
Quorum is established. Senator Berryhill.
Yes, I'd like maybe a comment from Ms. Bosler and maybe Mr. Taylor on this. It'd be brief, Mr. Chairman. You know, this committee, a lot of these folks are trying to whittle down what this debt is, but in fact, don't we have about $90 billion in issued bonds that isn't even accounted for here?
It's Finance's list. I don't believe they've included already issued bonds in the debt service on
That's
that.
right. Yeah, that's right.
So it's about $90 billion.
Of all bonds, if you're talking about all bonds, yeah, there are additional bonds beyond the unissued bonds that we are currently in the process of defeasing and paying down. This is just an assumption of the other bonds that are already authorized, but we actually haven't gone out to the market and sold. So it's more of a future long-term liability because we do have a payment plan right now. Debt service is fully funded, as it always has to be in the budget to cover the bonds that have already been sold.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Berryhill. And then also, just maybe to put a period on that, our indebtedness, bonded indebtedness, relative to the size of our budget, I think has come down from a high of about 8% to closer to 6%, so we're moving in the right direction. All right. Sorry for all the interruptions. Please proceed.
So just following up on the good, robust conversation about debt, the budget does propose to pay down the state's debts by $11 billion, and the bulk of that is going to pay off school deferrals, as I already mentioned, but also making a supplemental payment to completely pay off the economic recovery bonds, which again we're paying for debt from as far back, our budget deficits from as far back as 2002. And then finally, we're also making some early loan repayments related to transportation and the cap and trade program in order to get additional monies out the door to make needed investments in the maintenance of our roads and also to reduce greenhouse gases. Again, I think one of the very exciting things about this budget is the investment that the governor is able to, that we as a state are able to make in schools. And this budget provides around $10 billion in new monies to schools over and above the 2013 Budget Act. Proposition 30 has allowed for this reinvestment, which equates to about 11.4% increase over the 2013 Budget Act. It includes $4.5 billion to continue the implementation of the local control funding formula. It was an important reform that was enacted last year that will allocate relatively more money towards school districts that have a high proportion of students from low-income families and families and English language learners. Again, also, the budget allows us to finally pay off the school deferrals that have long plagued school districts. The budget also continues an investment in higher education with an 11.4% increase in the community colleges budget as well, which equates to over $1 billion in new monies for the community colleges. We also pay off the deferrals for the community colleges, provide additional money for enrollment growth, and also continue to make additional investments in the Student Success Task Force, which is really focusing the resources of the community colleges to improving student success in their higher education goals. And this year we have a particular emphasis on targeting some of those resources towards underrepresented groups at the community colleges. We also continue in the second year of a 4-year investment plan for UC and CSU by providing a 5% increase to both of those segments of higher education. We hold tuition rates flat. And also for the first time are proposing that the CSU and UC complete sustainability plans so we can really focus on not just rebuilding programs of old, but also setting the university systems on footing to be sustainable into the future, and really a focus on reducing the time it takes students to get to degrees. And then finally, we have a new innovation grant program of $50 million, and this is really targeted towards improving collaboration amongst the segments with, again, another focus on improving student success, but also reducing the time it takes students to get to degrees by better being able to use the community college system and the CSU system and UC system in a much more coordinated fashion. The budget also continues to strengthen the state's safety net that provides critical services to low-income Californians and Californians living with disabilities. This month, we are embarking on a historic implementation of healthcare reform. This month, millions more Californians will be covered through the healthcare exchange, Covered California, and also millions more Californians will be covered under the state's Medicaid program, Medi-Cal. The optional expansion that was approved last year expands coverage to childless adults, parent caretaker relatives up to 138% of federal poverty level. The budget includes $670 million in additional general fund resources to implement health care reform, including expanded Medi-Cal services for all Medi-Cal recipients that include enhanced mental health treatment services, substance use disorder programs, and also adult dental. The budget also assumes the passage of legislation that was enacted this last fall to increase the state's minimum wage by 25% over the next 2 years. It also includes a 5% increase in the CalWorks grant, $168 million to fund that. And then also we make an investment in a new pilot project with $115 million over the next 3 years for a new parent and child engagement pilot project to provide high-quality child care for children on the CalWorks program, and additional strategies to engage parents in their role as a parent, and also improving their ability to get back to work.
Ms. Bosler, with regard to Medi-Cal adult dental, is that a continuation of what we did last year, or is there further restoration, getting to full restoration?
No, there's not an additional restoration, just the level that was approved last year.
Very good. Senator Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Senator Leno. I was intrigued by this concept of a pilot, and if you could give me just a little more detail, because the way I read it, $150 million over 3 years in 6 counties for very few families is cause for pause. But it was my sense 2 years ago when the administration had the proposal to reduce CalWorks. Once again, federal welfare reform took us to 5 years. California actions took us to 48 months because of our budget concerns. 2 years ago, the administration proposed to take us to 24 months, 2 years, one of the shortest time spans in the country. And what we hoped and expected from the administration and the department was that in that 2-year period, we would kind of front load all of the support services to really make sure that families could successfully complete their CalWorks experience in a truncated amount of time. So what you're suggesting you're going to do in the pilot was my anticipation of what you were going to do in the first 24-month period as negotiated 2 years ago. So how does this pilot different from what's already supposedly happening within the 24-month CalWORKs time clock?
Yeah, so also embedded in the budget that I probably should have highlighted was $140 million for those early engagement programs, and that's the full year cost. Last year, the reinvestment started. This year, there's the full year costs because we agree that those 2 years are critical, and we really need to get in there and make sure that the families are getting the proper services in order to improve their ability to move on and get work and be sustainable, not on the CalWORKs program. So this grant program, or this not grant program, but this pilot project is slightly more nuanced because it would not only serve those families that are in the first 2 years, but it could also serve families that are already in sanctioned status. So,
Okay.
I mean, I think there's a recognition.
So child-only cases.
Yes, there's a recognition that these children could benefit significantly from enriched child care program, especially when the first couple years prior to going to school, and also the stability that comes with providing a full year of program as opposed to just a few months, depending on how much work the parent is able to get. So the pilot program is, I think, a little bit more far-reaching. The counties would have significant flexibility in terms of who they would target, but I think that's one of the different aspects of this new pilot.
So if we're targeting the child only, we had some concerns in previous years because we had some deep concerns about this notion of targeting child only and this notion that child only children were at greater risk than others, and this notion that counties didn't touch them as frequently. And we had some concern about why those families in particular were being targeted. Why not simply invest again in early care and education across the board? We had some reinvestment last year, but we're still 110,000 child care slots fewer. I mean, that's the one area where the reinvestment, if you will, has not kept pace with the level of cuts we experienced in early care and education in the past 3 or 4 budget years, not just even the whole 10 years. So why not just spend that money on high-quality early care and education slots across the board for the CalWORKs population?
That's a very good question, and I think that this budget as a whole strikes a balance because this is a more targeted program, a larger reinvestment. I think we have concerns given the volatility of the state's revenues and the risks that remain about sustaining a very large expansion in what would be an ongoing program. This is a pilot project for 3 years. Obviously, we will be studying it and understanding better how successful it has been, and with the idea that after those 3 years are complete, that there may be a case for a larger reinvestment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.